Michael Harrow squinted against the searing sunlight as he climbed the ridge, his boots crunching over dry earth and jagged rocks. The air was heavy with heat and dust, and the hum of cicadas filled the emptiness of the desert. He pulled his bandana tighter over his nose, cursing the monotony of the survey job that had brought him to this forsaken stretch of nowhere. Every day was the same: mark samples, take readings, and file reports that no one seemed to care about. Today, though, was different. There was something wrong with the ground beneath his feet. It had started with his instruments. The seismograph he'd been using to measure tectonic activity had gone haywire, its needle thrashing wildly as if responding to a distant earthquake. But the readings made no sense. They were too regular, almost like a heartbeat. Dismissing it as a malfunction, Michael had continued deeper into the desert, searching for the source of an unusual magnetic anomaly flagged by satellite data. When he reached the top of the ridge, he froze. Below him, the landscape shimmered unnaturally, as though a heat mirage had taken root in the earth itself. At the center of the shimmer was a crater, no larger than a few meters across, its edges scorched black. Something gleamed faintly at the center, pulsating with a dark, otherworldly light. He descended cautiously, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and unease. As he approached the object, he realized it wasn't a meteorite, or at least not like any he'd ever seen. It was roughly the size of a football, its surface smooth yet seemingly alive with motion. Shadows shifted across it in patterns that defied logic, spiraling inward like an infinite abyss. Michael reached out, then hesitated. His fingers tingled in the air near the object, as though touching it might burn him, or worse. He pulled a pen from his pocket instead, gently prodding the surface. The object responded with a faint hum, a vibration that traveled up the pen and into his hand. Startled, he stepped back, nearly tripping over a rock. "Jesus," he muttered, shaking his head. "What the hell is this?" He retrieved his phone to snap a picture, but the device flickered, its screen warping with static before shutting off completely. Frustrated, he shoved it back into his pocket and glanced at the object again. The hum had grown louder, more insistent, like a swarm of invisible bees. He felt it in his chest now, a pressure that made his ribs ache. Reluctantly, he decided to mark the site and return to camp to call it in. But as he turned to leave, the ground beneath him shuddered violently. He staggered, barely keeping his balance as the tremor subsided. Glancing back, he saw the object glowing brighter, its pulsations accelerating like the beating of a frantic heart. The air around it seemed to warp, bending light in strange, fluid ripples. Then, for just a moment, Michael thought he saw something impossible, a glimpse of another landscape bleeding through the fabric of reality. It was a barren, alien expanse, its sky churning with storms of black and violet. Jagged, crystalline spires jutted from the ground, and strange shapes moved in the distance, shapes that did not belong to anything from Earth. He blinked, and the vision was gone. The desert was silent again, save for the cicadas. But Michael's breathing was ragged, his pulse racing. He knew what he'd seen wasn't a trick of the light. By the time he returned to the temporary field station, dusk was falling, the horizon painted in hues of orange and crimson. He couldn't shake the sense of being watched, though the desert stretched empty and lifeless around him. The sensation persisted as he made his report to the local observatory, describing the object as best he could without sounding insane. They promised to send a team in the morning to investigate. That night, Michael lay awake in his cot, staring at the ceiling of his tent. The hum from the object seemed to echo in his ears, though he was miles away from the site. When sleep finally claimed him, it brought no relief. His dreams were filled with fractured images, endless voids of blackness, alien structures that defied geometry, and a presence, vast and unfathomable, that seemed to press down on him like the weight of a dying star. He awoke drenched in sweat, the taste of metal on his tongue, and the distinct feeling that he had brought something back with him from the crater. The following day, the team from the observatory arrived. They were efficient, their faces set in neutral professionalism, but Michael could see the unease in their eyes as they examined the site. The lead scientist, a tall woman named Dr. Lena Voight, spoke in clipped tones as she described the readings. "It's emitting a frequency we've never recorded before," she said, her brow furrowed. "Not just electromagnetic. There's something else. Almost organic." Michael didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the object, which now seemed dimmer, its pulsations slower, like a predator biding its time. That night, the tremors began again, stronger this time. Reports came in from the surrounding area, strange lights in the sky, livestock behaving erratically. Even a farmer who claimed to have seen his barn collapse in on itself like a crumpled piece of paper. Michael knew the object was responsible. He could feel its influence growing, reaching out like invisible tendrils. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. And then came the first vision. He had been sitting alone in his tent, reviewing his notes when the world around him seemed to blur. The edges of the tent wavered, folding inward like fabric sucked into a vortex. The light of his lantern twisted, casting impossible shadows that moved on their own. In the center of the distortion, a figure appeared, a silhouette tall and angular, its form barely comprehensible. It did not speak, but Michael felt its presence invade his mind, probing his thoughts with a cold, alien curiosity. Images flooded his brain, other worlds merging, collapsing into chaos, cities dissolving into molten rivers of flesh and metal. And always the black star, hanging in the sky, its dark glow swallowing everything. When the vision ended, Michael found himself on his knees, gasping for air. He looked at his hands and screamed. For a brief moment, his skin had not been his own. It had been translucent, crawling with veins and alien patterns that pulsed faintly in the dark. It was only the beginning. The first sign that the situation was worsening came at dawn. Michael awoke to the sound of a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was subtle at first, blending with the rustle of desert winds, but as the sun climbed higher, it grew louder, vibrating in his teeth and rattling the equipment inside the camp. The others noticed it too. Lena, pale and wide-eyed, muttered something about resonance frequencies as she studied her instruments. Michael didn't need science to tell him what he already knew. The black star's influence was spreading. It started small, with objects behaving in ways that defied logic. A sample jar on Lena's table appeared to stretch, elongating as if viewed through a warped lens before snapping back into place. A cup of coffee spilled upward instead of down, its dark liquid pooling on the underside of the tent's roof before evaporating. Michael felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not with the force of a tremor, but as though the soil was becoming unmoored from reality itself. By mid-afternoon, the first person went missing. Greg, one of the younger researchers, had wandered out to retrieve a piece of fallen equipment when the air around him seemed to shimmer. Michael, watching from a distance, saw Greg pause mid-step, his body blurring as though viewed through rippling water. Then he was gone. No scream, no trace, only the faint hum growing louder where he'd stood. The others panicked, calling out his name and scouring the area. Lena's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Stay close. We don't know what's out there." Her authority kept them from scattering, but Michael could see the cracks forming. The group was fraying at the edges, their fear palpable. That night, the camp was plunged into a waking nightmare. The hum, now omnipresent, seemed to resonate in their very bones, making it impossible to sleep. Shadows moved where there should have been none, long and angular, twisting across the ground in patterns that made Michael's stomach churn. He tried not to look at them, but his eyes were drawn to their unnatural motion, the way they didn't align with the movements of the wind or the firelight. Then the screams began. It was Sarah, the botanist, who stumbled into the main tent, clutching at her arm. "It touched me," she cried, her voice breaking. "Oh God, it's inside me." Michael rushed to her side, but stopped short when he saw the flesh of her arm shifting, bubbling as though something beneath her skin was trying to escape. Her nails splintered and fell away, replaced by sharp, translucent growths that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Lena acted quickly, sedating Sarah with a shot from the camp's medical kit. "It's spreading through contact," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The Black Star, or whatever it is, it's rewriting her. We need to contain this." They isolated Sarah in a separate tent, but no one could shake the unease that had settled over the camp. The transformation was no longer confined to her body. The tent itself seemed to warp around her, the fabric rippling like water. Michael heard faint whispers emanating from within, alien syllables that made his skin crawl. When he tried to listen closer, his vision swam, and for a moment he thought he saw the tent opening into another world, an endless expanse of jagged, crystalline spires beneath a churning sky. The next day, things escalated. The desert itself seemed to rebel. The horizon shimmered with heat, but also with something more, a distortion, like looking through cracked glass. Sand swirled upward in spiraling columns, defying gravity. Animals, desperate to flee the area, moved in strange, jerking motions, their bodies twitching as if caught in an invisible current. Michael saw a coyote collapse mid-run, its form splitting and reforming in grotesque ways. By the time he reached it, there was nothing left but a pile of twitching, boneless tissue. The group had no choice but to retreat deeper into the desert, away from the crater and the object at its heart. But the Black Star's reach was relentless. That night, their camp was engulfed by phenomena none of them could explain. Lena's calculations showed that space-time itself was distorting, creating micro-rifts that opened and closed randomly. Michael saw one of these rifts with his own eyes. It appeared as a thin, vertical slit in the air, shimmering faintly with an inner light. As he approached, he felt an intense pull, like 1,000 hands grasping at him, and he stumbled back just in time to avoid being drawn in. Through the slit, he caught a glimpse of something vast and alive, a mass of writhing tendrils that glistened with an iridescent sheen. The sight burned into his mind, and he vomited violently as soon as the rift closed. By the third day, the survivors were barely holding on. Sarah was gone, her tent collapsed inward as though consumed by an unseen force. Michael and Lena tried to rally the others, but it was clear that morale was crumbling. The group's engineer, a stoic man named Bryce, took his own life after finding his reflection in the mirror no longer matched his movements. Lena, though visibly shaken, refused to give in. She worked tirelessly, analyzing the fragment they had recovered from the crater. "This thing," she said, holding up a diagram of its energy signature, "it's not just a piece of the black star. It's a beacon, a signal, and it's calling the rest of it here." Her theory chilled Michael to the core. The fragment wasn't simply spreading the black star's influence. It was an anchor, pulling their dimension closer to the alien entity. The distortions, the mutations, the rifts, they were all symptoms of their world unraveling. "We have to destroy it," Lena said. "If we sever the connection, maybe we can stop this." But Michael wasn't so sure. The black star wasn't just an object or a force. It was alive. It felt conscious, aware of their efforts. He couldn't explain how he knew this, but the thought had burrowed into his mind, undeniable and terrifying. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, a vast, pulsating mass hanging in the void, its surface writhing with alien forms that shifted and changed with every heartbeat. As they prepared for the next phase of their desperate plan, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were too late. The black star wasn't just coming, it was already here, and its hunger was insatiable. The descent into the cavern felt like stepping into the maw of a living beast. The air grew colder with each step Michael and Lena took, yet it was charged with a suffocating energy that made their skin crawl. The walls around them pulsed faintly, as though alive, with veins of iridescent material that shifted between colors in impossible ways. Lena kept her flashlight aimed ahead, the beam trembling as much as her hands. Michael followed close behind, clutching the prototype destabilizer, a heavy, unwieldy device they'd cobbled together from scraps of the camp's equipment. "This place shouldn't exist," Lena muttered, her voice barely audible over the low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The geometry, it's—" "Don't try to explain it," Michael interrupted. "You'll lose your mind." The cavern wasn't just a space. It was a distortion of reality. Angles folded in ways that defied logic, and the path ahead seemed to stretch and contract, as if the space was breathing. Occasionally, Michael caught glimpses of other landscapes through the warped walls, barren wastelands, towering crystalline spires, and strange pulsating structures that reminded him of the black star itself. He avoided looking for too long, afraid that the visions might pull him in. They pressed on, their movements slow and deliberate. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the gravity itself was shifting. The hum grew louder, accompanied by an eerie, chittering sound that echoed faintly from the darkness ahead. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, each beat synchronized with the pulsing light that emanated from deeper within the cavern. When they reached the heart of the rupture, Michael stopped in his tracks, unable to breathe. The fragment had grown into a grotesque mass, a pulsating mound of alien tissue that seemed to fuse with the cavern itself. Its surface was slick and glistening, covered in ridges and spiraling patterns that twisted infinitely inward. The light it emitted was almost blinding, a black radiance that felt like it was seeping into Michael's skin. The air around it warped, distorting sound and vision, and the hum had transformed into a deep, resonant thrum that made his teeth ache. And it wasn't alone. Surrounding the mass were the remnants of the research team and others who had been lost to the Black Star's influence. They were no longer human. Their bodies had been reshaped into monstrous forms, limbs elongated and bent at impossible angles, flesh fused with shards of alien material that jutted from their skin. Their eyes were dark and lifeless, yet Michael could feel their gaze on him, cold and unrelenting. One of them moved, stepping forward with a jerking, unnatural motion. It made no sound, but its presence spoke volumes. Michael raised the destabilizer, his hands trembling as he tried to steady the device. The creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying him. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, it lunged. "Michael!" Lena shouted, shoving him aside. The creature's claws scraped the air where he'd stood moments before. Michael scrambled to his feet, the destabilizer slipping from his grip but not breaking. Lena fired a flare gun at the creature, the bright light searing the air and causing the thing to recoil with a guttural hiss. The flare didn't harm it, but it bought them time. "We need to move," Lena shouted, grabbing the destabilizer and thrusting it back into Michael's hands. "The core, it's destabilizing reality itself. We have to shut it down now." Michael nodded, his throat too dry to respond. They pushed forward, dodging the twisted forms that emerged from the shadows. The closer they got to the core, the more the cavern seemed to rebel against their presence. The ground shifted beneath their feet, cracking and folding in ways that defied gravity. Walls bent inward, then expanded outward, and Michael felt like he was walking through a nightmare that refused to end. The core loomed ahead, its pulsations now deafening. The air vibrated with a malevolent energy that made every nerve in Michael's body scream in protest. He and Lena reached the base of the mass, the destabilizer humming faintly as it synchronized with the fragment's frequency. "Set it up," Lena barked, already attaching the necessary components. Her movements were frantic but precise, a testament to her focus despite the chaos around them. Michael worked alongside her, locking the device into place and calibrating it to emit the destabilizing wave. But as they worked, the fragment responded. The pulsations quickened, and Michael felt a searing pain shoot through his skull. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head as visions assaulted him. He saw the black star in its entirety, a massive sentient entity that drifted through the void, consuming dimensions and merging them into itself. It wasn't just alive, it was ancient, infinite, and utterly incomprehensible. He saw worlds collapsing, their inhabitants twisted and reshaped into grotesque forms that served the Black Star's will. And he saw Earth, caught in its grasp, on the verge of being consumed. "Michael!" Lena's voice broke through the visions, dragging him back to reality. She was holding him by the shoulders, shaking him. "It's trying to stop you. Fight it." He nodded, his vision clearing enough to see the destabilizer sparking to life. But the fragment wasn't done. The twisted creatures surged toward them, their inhuman bodies moving with terrifying speed. Lena grabbed a wrench from her pack and swung it wildly, keeping them at bay while Michael finished the final calibration. "It's ready," he shouted, slamming the last switch into place. The destabilizer emitted a high-pitched whine, its energy building toward critical mass. But the fragment fought back, its pulsations becoming erratic. The cavern shook violently, chunks of rock falling from above as reality itself seemed to collapse around them. Then Michael felt it, a tug at his very being, as though the fragment was trying to pull him into itself. His body convulsed, and he looked down to see his hands flickering, their flesh warping and shifting. For a moment he saw his arm as something alien, its translucent skin crawling with veins that pulsed in time with the fragment. "No!" he screamed, forcing himself to focus. He gripped the destabilizer tightly, channeling all his will into activating it. "You're not taking me." With a final, deafening roar, the destabilizer unleashed its energy. The fragment writhed and screamed, not in sound, but in a wave of emotion and thought that filled the cavern. The twisted creatures collapsed, their forms dissolving into black, viscous pools. The fragment began to disintegrate, its pulsations slowing until it became nothing more than a faint glow. The cavern's walls stopped pulsing, their impossible geometries settling into something closer to reality. The hum faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt almost alien in its stillness. Michael and Lena stood together, battered and broken but alive. The destabilizer had done its job, severing the fragment's connection to the Black Star. But as they made their way out of the cavern, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Black Star was still out there, drifting in the void, waiting for its next opportunity, and he knew deep down that it would never stop. The night sky above the desert was unnaturally clear, every star visible as a needlepoint of cold light against the abyss. Yet, amidst their distant, indifferent glimmers, one star stood apart, a dark wound in the heavens. The Black Star loomed, its presence a smothering weight that defied comprehension. It was alive, pulsing faintly like a predator at rest, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Michael Harrow stared up at it, his body trembling with exhaustion, his mind on the brink of collapse. He had seen too much, survived too much. And now, at the edge of reality's unraveling, there was one last task left to him. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by Lena's labored breathing beside him. The trek out of the cavern had taken its toll on both of them. Her left arm hung limp at her side, twisted into a grotesque shape that shimmered faintly with an alien sheen. She refused to let Michael look at it, refused to acknowledge the pain etched across her face. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice hoarse, "before it's too late." Michael nodded, gripping the destabilizer's portable trigger in his hands. The device was damaged, its housing cracked and sparking from the overload it had endured, but it was still functional, still capable of delivering one final burst of energy to sever the Black Star's influence. The only question was whether it would destroy them in the process. They had retreated to higher ground, overlooking the crater where the fragment had once lain. The site was eerily quiet now, its unnatural hum replaced by an oppressive silence. But the air shimmered faintly, as if the fabric of reality was still healing. Michael could feel the Black Star's presence pressing down on him, its influence lingering even after the fragment's destruction. It wasn't just a distant celestial body. It was here, woven into the very essence of the world, and it wasn't going to stop. "I don't think we severed the connection," Michael said, his voice hollow. "We only slowed it down. It's still reaching for us." Lena exhaled shakily, glancing at the Black Star above them. Its dark glow seemed to pulse in time with her ragged breaths. "Then we'll stop it for good," she said, her determination cutting through the despair in her voice. "We've come this far. We finish it." As they set up the destabilizer for one final activation, Michael's mind raced. The Black Star was vast, ancient, and unknowable. He had seen its nature, glimpsed its hunger in the visions it had forced into his mind. It wasn't just consuming dimensions, it was assimilating them, blending realities into its own incomprehensible existence. To destroy it, even to sever its connection, felt impossible. And yet, There was no other choice. When the device was ready, Lena turned to Michael. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes were fierce. "I'll trigger it," she said. "You get clear." Michael shook his head. "We both know it doesn't work like that. The energy pulse—" "Don't argue with me," Lena snapped, her voice cracking. "You have to live through this, Michael. Someone has to. If we fail, someone has to warn them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Michael wanted to protest, to refuse, but he knew she was right. He couldn't see a way out of this, not for both of them. His chest tightened as he met her gaze, searching for something, anything, that could offer an alternative. But there was nothing. "Lena," he began, his voice trembling. "Don't waste time," she interrupted, her tone softening. Just do what you have to. And when it's done, look up at the sky. Make sure it's gone." Michael's throat tightened as he nodded, his hands trembling as he handed her the trigger. She smiled faintly, a ghost of her usual confidence, before turning her attention to the device. Michael backed away slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Then the ground began to shake. The black star's influence surged, distorting the air around the crater. Michael could see the edges of reality fraying, twisting into impossible shapes. The stars in the sky seemed to stretch and ripple, their light bending in ways that defied comprehension. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, louder than ever before, vibrating through his bones. Lena worked quickly, her hands a blur as she calibrated the destabilizer. But as the device powered up, the black star seemed to react. Tendrils of darkness stretched from the sky, writhing and coiling as they descended towards the crater. They weren't physical, not exactly. They were distortions, cracks in the fabric of space-time, but they moved with purpose, as if alive. "Lena, hurry!" Michael shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing roar. "I'm almost there," she yelled back, her fingers flying over the controls. The destabilizer began to hum, its core glowing faintly as it built toward activation. But the tendrils were closing in, drawn to the energy like predators to prey. Michael acted on instinct, grabbing a length of steel piping from the ground and charging toward the device. He swung wildly at the nearest distortion, the pipe passing through it without resistance. But the act seemed to distract it, the tendril recoiling momentarily. Michael continued, yelling and striking at the air, buying Lena precious seconds. "Got it!" she shouted, slamming the final switch into place. The destabilizer whined, its energy output spiking as it prepared to unleash its full charge. But the black star wasn't finished. The distortions surged toward Lena, converging on her with terrifying speed. Michael sprinted toward her, his lungs burning, but he knew he wouldn't make it in time. Lena looked up, meeting his gaze one last time. "Go!" she screamed, her voice breaking with emotion. "Go now!" And then the destabilizer activated. The explosion wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a rupture in reality itself. Light and darkness collided, creating a blinding flash that swallowed everything. Michael felt himself thrown backward, the ground vanishing beneath him as the world fractured around him. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and light, stretching endlessly in all directions. When he awoke, the night sky was still. The black star was gone. Michael lay on the ground, staring upward as the star slowly came into focus. The weight that had pressed on his mind and soul was lifted, replaced by an aching emptiness. He sat up, his body screaming in protest, and looked toward the crater. It was empty. The destabilizer, the fragment, and Lena, all gone. The ground was scorched black, but there was no sign of the rupture, no sign of what had happened. Michael staggered to his feet, his vision swimming, and stumbled toward the edge of the crater. "Lena," he whispered, his voice cracking. But there was no answer. He fell to his knees, staring at the empty void where she had been. The victory felt hollow, the weight of her sacrifice crushing him. But as he looked up at the stars, he saw something he hadn't expected. Peace. The sky was still unbroken, and for the first time in days, the air felt normal. The black star was gone, but Michael knew the scars it had left on the world, on him, would never truly heal. He stayed there until dawn, watching as the first light of day crept over the horizon. The sky turned from black to deep blue, the stars fading one by one. And as the sun rose, Michael whispered a quiet promise to the void. "I'll remember.